the world's writers will walk through those gates. And if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
I hope you enjoy your events in this year's digital programme and that they spark in you thoughts and conversations and feelings. All the things that a good book should do and all the things that a wonderful book festival like Edinburgh International Book Festival does too. It's a book festival that's really dear to my heart. It's one of the first festivals I attended as a new author. I was part of their Outriders Africa programme, and every year returning to it feels a little bit like coming back to a literary home. It's such a pleasure to see them going online this year, and I'm so excited for the future of Edinburgh International Book Festival.
Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival online. My name's Jenny Brown. I'm a literary agent based here in Edinburgh. And to use today's author's terminology, about 450 moons ago, I was the first ever director of this festival. The book festival was pioneering then, back in 1983, only one of 2 literature festivals in the UK. And this year's superb online festival, reaching audiences all around the world as it keeps the conversation going, shows it's even more groundbreaking now. Big thanks to the Hawthorne Dun Literary Retreat for sponsoring this event. And for the next hour, I have the pleasure of talking to one of the finest of writers. Sebastian Barry is a playwright, a poet, and a fiction writer. He's the only novelist to win the Costa Book of the Year twice. His novels have twice been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and his novel Days Without End won the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction. He's also the current Irish laureate for fiction. We're going to be discussing his latest book, the beautiful, remarkable, and moving novel, A Thousand Moons. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and there'll be time for Sebastian to answer your questions. Submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And there's a button on your screens too, giving you the chance to buy a copy of the book from the online bookshop. And every copy bought from the online bookshop supports the work of the festival too. Sebastian, welcome back to the Edinburgh International Book Festival.
I'm so thrilled to be almost there, spiritually anyway.
Sebastian, where are you? Where are you talking to us from?
I'm in the mysterious Wicklow Mountains along the Wicklow Way, which is our beautiful walking route from Dublin. So I'm basically in paradise, rivaling the paradise of Scotland.
Sebastian, over the years, your novels have given us a great and powerful web of story and history of the Dunn and McNulty families. Taken together, they offer a remarkable portrait of the Irish diaspora and the way Irish lives have intersected with world events. In A Thousand Moons, you pick up the story, a thread of the story from Days Without End. It's set in 1870s Tennessee, and you give voice and story to the young Lakota girl who was adopted by Thomas and John Cole, Winona. And I wonder, had it always been in your mind that you wanted to tell Winona's story?
Curiously enough, one of the mysterious benefits of going to festivals and doing festival events is that afterwards, as you know, we have a book signing, and people say things to you at those signings. And one of the things said to me at one of the signings for Days Without End was, would you consider the fact that Winona doesn't get to tell her own story, and would you try and tell her story for her? Now, of all the things said to me, I could have wandered off home and forgotten that, but it stayed in my mind, and it seemed to me a mark of the importance of these aftermaths of events where you do have these important conversations, that I should consider that. And having begun to consider it, it didn't go away, which is the test really of whether you're going to write a book or not. Are you still going to be thinking about it? Is it still going to be both haunting you and bothering you at the same time? Well, let me pretend it was Edinburgh, because I actually can't remember, but let's say it was Edinburgh. Or failing that, the Borders, which it could also have been, the Borders Festival.
It's a study of a young woman's determination, really, to write her own future. And much of the novel tracks the very complicated fallout from an assault on her. She's raped. She's traumatized by the assault. She can't recall what happens to her that night. And indeed, she's got no words. She's got no words to describe what happened to her. And she kind of needs to be her own detective. I wonder if you can start us out by reading so we can hear Winona's voice.
I certainly will. This is literally that frightening thing in a book called Chapter 1, frightening for the writer anyway. I am Winona. In early times, I was Odajinka, which means rose. Thomas McNulty tried very hard to say this name, but he failed, and so he gave me my dead cousin's name because it was easier in his mouth. Winona means firstborn. I was not firstborn. My mother, my elder sister, my cousins, my aunts, all were killed. They were souls of the Lakota that used to live on those old plains. I wasn't too young to remember. Maybe I was 6 or 7, but all the same, I didn't remember. I knew it happened because afterwards the soldiers brought me into the fort, and I was an orphan. A little girl can suffer many a sea change. By the time I got back to my people, I couldn't converse with them. I remember sitting in the teepee with the other women and not being able to answer them. By that time, I was all of 13 or so. After a few days, I found the words again. The women rushed forward and embraced me as though I had only just arrived to them that very moment. Only when I spoke our language could they really see me. Then Thomas McNulty came to get me again and took me back to Tennessee. Even when you come out of bloodshed and disaster, in the end, you have got to learn to live. You have to look about you, see how things are, grow things or buy things as the case may be. The little town nearby us in Tennessee was called Paris. Lige Megan's farm was about 7 miles out. It was quite a few years after the war, but the town was still full of rough Union soldiers kicking their heels, and the defeated butternut boys were a sort of secret presence though they were not in their uniforms. Vagabonds on every little byway, and state militia watchful for those vagabonds. It was a town of many eyes watching you anyhow, an uneasy place. To present yourself in a dry goods store to buy items, you have got to have best English or something else happens. At the fort, Mrs. Neal had given me my first English words. In later times, John Cole got me 2 books of grammar. I looked at them long and good. It is bad enough being an Indian without talking like a raven. The white folks in Paris were not all good speakers themselves. Some were from other places, Germans, Swedes, some were Irish, like Thomas McNulty, and only got to English when they got to America. But myself, being a young Indian woman, I guess I had to talk like an empress. Of course, I could have offered my list of items that Rosalie Bougereau, who worked on Lige's farm, had written out, but it was better to speak. Else what was happening was I was going to be beaten up every time I was in town. It was English kept me from that. Some straggly farmhand might look at you and see the dark skin and the black hair and think that gave him a right to knock you down and kick you. No one saying boo to him for that. No sheriff or deputy neither. It wasn't a crime to beat an Indian, not at all. John Cole, even though he had been out as a soldier and was a good farmer, got bad treatment in town because his grandmother, or the woman before his grandmother, was an Indian person. So that was writ in his face a little. Even English couldn't protect him because he was a big grown man, maybe. He couldn't hope for mercy just all the time. He had a lovely face, as people attested, in especial Thomas McNulty, but I guess the townsmen could sometimes see the Indian in it. They beat him so bad, and then he was just a plank of suffering in the bed, and Thomas McNulty swearing he would go in and kill someone. But Thomas McNulty's shortcoming was he was poor. We were all poor. Lige Megan was poor enough, and he owned the farm, and we were poor underneath Lige. Poor worse than Lige. When a poor person does anything, he has to do it quietly. When a poor person kills, for instance, he has got to do it very quietly and run as fast as those little deer that float out of the woods. Also, Thomas had been in Leavenworth prison for desertion, so the uniforms about the town made him jumpy, even though he always said he loved the army. I myself was lower than Rosalie Bougereau. She was a black-skinned saint of a woman, let me tell you. She used to go out and shoot rabbits with her brother's rifle along the backwoods of Lige's farm there in the famous battle with Tash Petrie, famous to us anyhow, when he and his accomplices had tried to rob us, advancing on our homestead with implacable intent. She distinguished herself by reloading the rifles faster than ever was. So said John Cole. But she was a slave before the war, and a slave is low down in the eyes of white folks, of course. So I was lower than that. I was just the cinders of an Indian fire in the eyes of the town. Indians in bulk were long gone from Henry County, Cherokee, Chickasaw. Folks didn't like to see an ember drifting back. In the eyes of the great mystery, we were all souls alike, trying to make our souls skinny enough to squeeze into paradise. That's what my mother said. Everything I remember of my mother is like the little pouch of things that a child carries to hold what is precious to her. When such a love is touched by death, then something deeper even than death grows in your heart. My mother fussed over us, and my sister. She was interested in how fast we could run and how high we could jump, and she never tired of telling us how pretty we were. We were just little girls out there on the plains under the starlight. Thomas McNulty sometimes liked to tell me I was as pretty as the things he thought were pretty, roses, robins, and the like. It was mother's talk he was doing because I had no mother then. It was strange that in the old wars he had killed many of my people when he was a soldier. He might have killed even some of my own family. He didn't know. I was too young to remember, I would say to him. Of course I hadn't been, but it came to the same thing. Used to make me feel very strange listening to him talk about that. I would start to burn from the center of my body. I had my own little pearl-handled gun that the poet McSweeney gave me in Grand Rapids. I could have shot Thomas with that. Sometimes I thought I should shoot something, shoot someone. Of course, I did shoot one of Tash Petrie's men, not actually during the famous battle, but another time when they accosted us on the road, right through the chest. And he shot me, but it was only a bruise, not a wound. I had the wound of being a lost child. Thing was, it was they that healed me. Thomas McNulty and John Cole, they had done their damnedest, I guess. So they both gave me the wound and healed it, which is a hard fact in its way. I guess I had no choice in the matter. Once your mother is taken from you, you can't ever catch up with her again. You can't cry out, "Wait for me," when the winds turn cold under a wolf moon and she has walked far ahead of you across the grasses, searching for wood.
It's a beautiful start to the novel, and it introduces so many themes that you then go on to explore. I just wonder, how did Winona's voice come to you, and what was behind the decision to make it a first-person narrative? Was that always obvious to you from the outset?
Well, the first of these books, way back when I started in 1993, was written in the third person. It's The Whereabouts of Thomas McNulty. Another of the books, A Long, Long Way, which is about Willie Dunn at the First World War, is also third person. But I've spent so many years in the theater, mostly getting it wrong, but sometimes miraculously things coming right for us with a production, that I have come to revere the power and the simplicity and the hidden complexity and the very life force contained within the first person narrative. The person in front of you speaking out. And as always has been my suspicion, or is my suspicion now, that in the very syntax of sentences is hidden the DNA of the character. And that if you can access, well, you're making it up, but if always allowing the fact that we're making it up, if you can make it up in such a way that somehow there's an authenticity around it, then something happens that is beyond this, the foolish writer, beyond the whole business of publishing. You may have by accident, by some really desirable magic, brought back from the cold hand of history somebody. And I suspect that, that's my ultimate aim. And as you know, Einstein actually approves of this writerly undertaking of the historical novel, because he said, of course, all things are happening everywhere all the time. So you could actually make the argument that it would be possible by some sixth sense or something to get back to the 1870s and find, genuinely find Winona there. And unless that happens, actually, you might as well, I can't say go home because I would be working at home, but the other part of that is you have to sit very quietly, sometimes for 9 months, sometimes for a year, until you absolutely believe that the writer in you has been dispensed with and you're just the listener and the seer of this person. These are tall orders, and I make a book every 3 years, and I do have my doubts about the whole enterprise. But anyway, this is when I'm not being critical of myself, these are the things I tell myself to justify what I've been doing for the last 30 years.
Remembering becomes a dangerous activity for Winona. What did you want to explore about memory in the book?
Well, it's the point. In my own childhood, it became clear to me over the decades that there were certain things that must have happened that I simply couldn't remember. And yet these things were key to my survival, key to my formation of some workable character in the world. So this whole business, I mean, I'm reading actually at the moment a wonderful book about, I think it's called Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, about the violence done to women during wartime. And even in Days Without End, in A Long, Long Way, which is, as I say, about a young Irish soldier going to the war, there is a scene in that where a woman suffers a most appalling rape. And Willie is told this by his friend who has been engaged in this dreadful activity. And I remember at the time, I think it was even Mary McAleese, our president, who read the book and liked the book a lot. And she said she was harrowed by that passage. But it is something that happens in war. And it's only now properly being included in the narrative, especially this brilliant book I'm reading now. The fact is that sometimes, and we know for somebody like Winona, who's only 17, and when she's 6 or 7, she simply lost everybody that was dear to her and all the things she knew in the world that she knew in a cataclysm of 3 or 4 minutes of army men killing everything that they could find in the smoke. And so she's young enough, as she says, to remember, but at the same time, she doesn't remember. And even in the course of the book, you might expect it to be a book about her remembering that more clearly, but that is not really the case. But she has a better intimation of what it means to forget things or not to be able to remember. Of course, forgetting is not the same thing as not remembering. The thing that has happened to her in the present moment has a traumatic effect on her equal in some ways to what has happened to her as a little girl. So the response of her brain is to put that as well in the dark trunk of things that she can't see in her imagination. So literally, that's her task, is to shine a light on something that is going to be terribly painful. But she's old enough and brave enough, and this is a book for me very much about the courage of women, to know that without accessing the truth of what has happened to her, the picture of what has happened to her, the little film of what has happened to her, she cannot be complete in herself for the journey ahead that she is intent on undertaking. She is going to be alive. She is going to live. She is going to be, in my estimation, probably one of the most important individuals in America. That's how I would characterize her, because of course there's so much in American history and in American discourse even now that tries to diminish somebody like her and make her seem unimportant.
She's also got to come to some kind of accommodation to the fact, and you allude to this in that reading you did, that the people who love her most, Thomas and John, are complicit in the massacre of her people.
Yes. And I mean, it's worse than that. Obviously there are no social services in these times. I mean, they would be having a field day with all this. It's really, in many ways, not admirable, because Mrs. Neal, who takes these children in off the battlefield, as it were, to educate them at the fort, this is in Days Without End, isn't educating them to become members of society, as she understands it. These people are prisoners of war, these little babes. She's educating them to be servants. Starling Carlton, who is one of the other soldiers, has a horrible notoriety as a stealer of children. He is one of those people who has been literally roaming around California, taking native children and bringing them to the cities to sell them on as God knows what, hopefully servants, but so this is, when Thomas and John take her, as it were, from Mrs. Neal, they're not, it is as a servant. Thomas has taken a shine to Winona, but nevertheless, that's the relationship. It doesn't take them long, however, to discover that she is, in essence, I mean, in spiritual terms and all other terms, their daughter. And that is now going to be their life's work to protect her, because she literally gives them a dimension to their lives that completes them as human beings. So it's not that, Thomas's intentions were noble and good. They were quite casual, and in many ways, very much like Thomas. One thing borrows another thing for him. And yet, he is the person, alongside John Cole, who has been responsible for the death of her people. So how do you balance that out? And Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish poet, might say in one of his poems, "Nothing whatsoever is by love debarred." And that must be the answer to this, because as she says herself, sometimes she feels she should shoot someone for what's happened to her. But there is this returning birdsong of love in her for these two men who fully and passionately and entirely and universally return that love.
Can you say a little bit more about the courage of Winona, and what you've found over the years about the courage of women in general?
Well, look at me. I am a 65-year-old white Irish male writer, probably not the cleverest brick in the wall. What do I know? Well, one of the things I know is accidental, not quite as atrociously accidental as Thomas taking Winona, but I have been a father to two girls, and over those years, you notice, because you can't help but notice, the continuing courage required to be simply female in our society. One of my sons, Toby, is gay, and that was another revelation, but equally so, the ordinary dangers that are put in front of young women and girls all the time. It didn't so much shock me as alert me. You'd want to arm yourself, almost in Thomas's terms as a father, put bullets in your gun in some way. This is my, Seamus Heaney said he was going to dig with his pen instead of his father digging with a spade. So I can't shoot anybody, but I can try and write a book that itemizes or even fails to illuminate this area of sort of tremendous courage. I mean, you have to have it. So that's another aspect of it, but people do have it. I mean, I haven't just seen this in my daughters, but, in my wife, also in my friends. I have a lovely friend, you've probably never heard of her. She's called Ali Smith. She's like an emperor of writers in Scotland. Maybe you just haven't noticed her, but when I met her in 2005, I think it was, she invited me to Germany for some event. I was very overwhelmed by her and how she lived in the world, and how she had created a kind of, it's not a militant philosophy, but it is a philosophy of, it's very like the native habit of putting important objects in a little bag when you're riding into battle and you tie it to your saddle. that sort of important mobilization of yourself that you needed to do. So it's just, I mean, I've been alive for a while, and I have lived among women. You know, when I was a little boy, my great aunt Annie was my favorite person. I wrote a novel for her called Annie Dunn, and my ambition as a little boy of 6 wasn't to be an engine driver. It was to be a 60-year-old woman like Auntie Anne, because I thought that was the best example of humanity I had encountered in my career of encountering people at the age of 6. And nearby were my cousins who were called the Duns of Fedden. They were 3 sisters who lived together, no men involved, who did all the plowing, and their hands were raked with cuts from the plow, and you know, they were digging and ditches, and you know, these were for a child not frightening empresses, but they were definitely up there, you know, among the great figures of the world, and could have had, you know, could still have books written about them. I've only managed one for Annie. So again, courage, because Annie Dunn, whom I only knew in her, you know, these years that I am now in, she had a hunchback, as they called it, from polio. So she was considered to be unmarriageable. Now this was a terrible penance. This was like a sentence of death for her. And sure enough, when we were left with her in the summer of 1959, my sister and myself, our parents were quite extravagant people. My mother's an actor, my father's an architect, poet. I didn't see too much of them, but she turned out to be the greatest instance of mothering that you could imagine. She wrapped us around, and she gave us something for the first time, which was a feeling of safety as children, which we never had had. And that's what I tried to give my children. And Winona, for herself, says something in this book that's also, I've noticed. She says, there's a time for a child to be assisted by their parents. And then the time comes when you have to do it for yourself. And I think that time has come, she says. And that's another thing I've noticed, that at a certain point, your children don't want your stupid metaphorical guns or your knives or anything to help them. Or, you know, they want to do it for themselves. And that in itself is a kind of world-redeeming courage. So that's, for me, was what the book is trying to itemize that world-redeeming courage of, in particular, young women.
Leads me, what you've just said about your relatives leads me on to think about, in your work in general, you've got a wonderful gift for finding the extraordinary in what other people might deem ordinary. And with Winona, again and again, we hear that she knows she's lower than the low, less than the least of them. Even though, you know, she says, just because John Cole raised me up as something so gold, he said that the sun itself was jealous of me. Didn't mean anyone else in the wide world thought that. So I wonder, how do you do that? How do you live with grace when you are considered lower than anything?
Well, because that's been my experience of the world. I mean, even at that young age. I mean, obviously Annie Dunn was the most important person in Ireland alive at that time. Just other people couldn't see her. If somebody looked at somebody like that, I mean, a city person in their Morris Minor going by, they'd just see a woman heading into her 60s in a polka dot dress, you know, those blue and white dresses that country people wore. She wouldn't seem, and you know, on top of that, she would have looked a little bit, you know, strange, and with her wild hair and all that. But I saw it as a child. I mean, my research, all my best research was done from the age of, you know, 2 to 10, and I noticed. I didn't just notice the grace in these people. I was in the wind of it, in the wind of their grace. It was blowing through me. In recent times, as the laureate for Irish fiction, which has been quite a transforming experience in itself for me. For instance, with my book club, I've gone into places where the idea was that I would go to places where people were temporarily stuck and couldn't come to me. Well, that turns out now to be the whole world with the pandemic. But anyway, this is before the pandemic. And, you know, I went into mysterious places I was a little afraid to go into. For instance, the Central Mental Hospital here in Dublin, where you go if you're presumed not guilty, or you're not guilty by reason of insanity. Terrible things may have occurred in your life, but you're not guilty. And you might say, well, there's people of no account and their tickets of life have been cancelled and rescinded. But when we went in there, myself and an amazing woman called Marcella Bannon, who is the administrator of the laureateship, we went in there together. We had these almost out-of-body experiences with people where 40 of the people there, one by one, or numbers of them getting up to make speeches that had a sort of Ciceronian glamour to them. One man who was from Italy, he spoke about philosophy. And you just realize that you may have had the luck and somehow to avoid this fate, but nevertheless, it was still true that these people actually were more tremendous than you, more important. Again, referencing for the second time an Irish president, we've been very, very lucky in our presidents. I was talking about this to Michael D. Higgins because he was the lovely man who put the medal of the laureateship around my neck. And he agreed with me, which I thought was a profoundly important thing for the president of a country to believe, that the finest citizens, the most important citizens, can seem to be the ones that you might discount at the margins. I would also include the whole world of the traveling community, the travelers. There's a wonderful book just coming out of traveler stories by Owen de Verdun, which just proves this important resource of grace, as you say, and glory, actually. I mean, we're talking about human glory that's over and above, fellas going to war, or now fellas and ladies going to war, and the glory of that and how America is great and all this. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with, as I say, the putative and probably non-existent gate of St. Peter, where he will say, even though he doesn't exist, what did you do, or what did you see, or why should I let you in here? And you will say, well, because I loved my great aunt Annie, understood how important she was. Oh yes, actually, she's inside here. She is actually one of the principal citizens of this place, and the people in the Central Mental Hospital. Oh yes. Well, we're looking forward to them. We know, it's that. It's not where you think it is. It's that thing, Jenny, when you go looking for your bloody old passport or whatever, and you find that spoon or that thing that you lost so many years ago. And as you stand there holding it, you say, well, I wasn't even looking for this. I had even forgotten I'd lost it. But now I am seeing the importance of this object that is now accidentally in my hand, which is a book for me.
Peg. She arrives into the novel in her yellow dress. And then from then on, she lights up every page she's on. Tell us about Peg.
Well, Jenny, I was sitting in this chair, in this house, in these mountains, writing this book, in this position, in front of this computer. And in the space of a second, 1 second, Peg had no existence that I knew of. And this makes me suspicious, of the actual Einsteinian aspect of time, that it's true. And the next instance, Peg was there, holding onto that bush in the river, shooting at poor Winona and hitting her. And then Winona has to decide whether or not to rescue this person who has, after all, just shot her. Well, I don't know. I couldn't have told you in that moment what my name was. But I knew her name. I just said, and she just wrote that word, Peg, and that was Peg. And I don't know where she came from. She didn't give any advance warning. She didn't send a messenger or a postcard or anything. She was never in a note. She was never in any supposition. And, if Winona was surprised, I was astonished. There she was, Peg. And not only my reward for being alive writing the book, but in a sense, her reward for having the courage, I mean, Winona's courage, to go out and try and do something about this herself. Because in the doing of that, like she was looking for her passport, but she found Peg.
Was there any concern in your mind as you were writing that there was going to be any charges of cultural appropriation?
I mean, in a way, it's not that, stupidus in Latin means kind of thick, like something that takes, that light takes some time to pass through. So I'm a bit that way. I'm not, I'm a bit dense. And I find writing a book such an emergency, sort of an unlikely thing. Like, I can never understand how I did it before and why would it happen again. These are always my worries. Not the authenticity of the people I'm writing about, but of the actual act of writing, that it actually is meaningful and isn't foolish, entirely foolish. So the honest answer would be no. But when I started to hear about cultural appropriation, it was those crass things of people wearing sombreros at parties who had no right to it, or who were mocking, or who were disrespectful of other cultures. But to my mind, you see, unless the writer, whoever that is, he, she, or they, is prepared to meet the requirement of crossing over into other states of being, then to my mind, that's just not doing it. They're not doing their job. They're not frightening themselves enough. I rest my faith also in, what Mr. Dillinger in On Canaan's Side says is the most important thing we've been told in our lifetimes, which is about DNA, and that all modern humans, no matter who they are, whether they're native peoples of Siberia, native peoples of America, if there's such a thing as native peoples of Ireland, of Scotland, of Mesopotamia, that they all, every modern human goes back to these 3 to 5 women in Africa. So that means, as Mr. Dillinger says, and as I have said before, the good news is we're all the same family. And the bad news is we're all the same family, because we know what bloody trouble families are. But nevertheless, if we meet each other across a continent or across a time span, and Winona has to imagine me in a way for me to be able to imagine her, to feel her presence. That to me is a sort of act of necessary human, maybe tuppenny halfpenny magic, but it's a very important tuppenny halfpenny magic. I mean, you can revile it and say that, that's contemptible, that's just making things up. But I'm hoping that beyond, as I said before, beyond this idea of making up, there's something else going on that's a bit bigger and a bit better than the individual who is undertaking it. I felt an imperious demand from Winona, and as it turned out, Peg, to tell that one story about those 2 people, that one person, Winona, in that one time, in that one place, in a singular, and as if to say, well, we could have picked somebody else a little cleverer than you, Sebastian, but you're the only person we could get on this strange Einsteinian phone that we've been using. So you're the best we could do. So just do your best, you idiot. That's the way I approached it. And for me to feel for 1 second that Winona had come into my workroom would give me such a sense, and did give me, if I'm being honest, such a sense of profound privilege and human happiness, that's really where I am with that. I am very aware that as a human being, since Winona's done her living, we may assume, Pache Einstein, that I need her far more than she needs me.
I hope we might see her again.
Well, this is the trouble of loving your characters. You're unhappy to be without them. And you can't keep reading your book. And I've never read any of my books, so you can't do that. So in a way, your only option is to try and, make another mistake. Which is basically what we're trying to do, survive our mistakes.
What kind of research does it take to write a novel, either like Days Without End or A Thousand Moons?
Well, again, you're looking at that. You're looking at a man who was, an 8-year-old who couldn't read or write. And when I was a little boy, we went to London, and somehow that disruption just threw me, and I couldn't learn to read or write at my LCC school in New End in Hampstead. I just couldn't do it. And I came back to Ireland, and we got the catechism in the class, the Catholic catechism. And I literally learned to read off that because of the repetition and learning it off by heart and just putting words together. But it was quite difficult, and it's still quite difficult, even though I have a degree in Latin and English from Trinity College. Nevertheless, I was the slowest reader of Latin in the history of the world for that reason. And I'm so glad I did it, but I did it very slowly. So I still read slowly, and to do books like this, you feel you must at least read the books that are available. There are many books that are unavailable in the sense that they're not written yet or never will be written. Probably the most important books, which would be full testimony, full account of, say, Native American experience. Those books, to some degree, only to a very small degree, exist. Though a lot of the time you're getting these things through European or white history, as you might say. So that's not very satisfactory, but nevertheless, probably there's 150 books. I only just brought them upstairs to the bookcase upstairs the other day. They were all over the floor, all around me. I was besieged by them. And to some degree, when I was having to read them, terrorized. But the wonderful thing about doing that is you mustn't take notes. Well, I don't take notes. If in the course of your reading you come across something, for instance, I found this word, Jenny, sockdologer, which I'm offering to you. Please try and use it. I'm trying to get it back into the world. And it means the best example of something. And it faded away in the 1880s in America. Nobody used it anymore. So I read it somewhere. I've remembered it. When I was writing the book then, many months later, and this uprose this word as if I had actually heard it in the, John Cole saying this, and it's in the book. So they're the things that are important. You read all these books and you think, oh, it's so important. Yes, these battles, blah, blah, blah. But actually it's these little tiny things that become, because they're the things that sink down like pennies, in the fountain. They have
Say the word again.
Sockdologer.
Okay, well, try to use it.
You're the sockdologer of agents. It's not a thing, you could say. Or you can say to your one of your authors, I wouldn't say this to anyone else, but you're the sockdologer of my clients. I love you best. Of course, you'd never say that. But if you need to say it at some point, even to lie, it would be a useful word, sockdologer. I've been trying to get it back into the usage. I've said it on the BBC. I've said it numerous places, but I don't hear it back. I'm in despair. Anyway, this is how you make a book, or I make a book, with these little twigs and sticks rubbed together to make a bit of smoke and a bit of flame. And that's my research. So you read the books, but at the same time, there's something in the book reading you, and you're the fountain, and they're dropped into you, these pennies and stones of information that you couldn't make notes about, because you'd be always making notes for the wrong things, which would only confuse you and scuttle your efforts.
We've been getting some questions from folk watching, and Hazel A is asking you, A Thousand Moons is convincingly set in time and place. Are there any American writers of the West whom you particularly admire?
Yes, but I think, do you know, a lot of them are those interesting, you know, the Russian icon makers never signed their names on their icons, the really good ones, because they thought, well, this is in praise of God, it's not about my name. Sometimes I see screenwriters, my wife is a screenwriter, in that light. Do you know, they're making something in praise of humanity. They don't need, so screenwriters aren't often well known. But whoever wrote the screenplay for, say, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is from a rather bread and butter novel, but the screenplay, maybe it was Huston himself, I actually don't know, or I must look it up. But whoever wrote that, I revere them, this nameless Russian icon maker equivalent screenwriter. And surely, just as you might think importance lies in the films that were given the Oscars, surely all those B movies that we saw in the Adelphi cinema at the top of our road in Dunleary when we were children on a Saturday for one and threepence crammed into the balcony, had a profound impression, made a profound impression on me. You know, when you're talking about the West, Tessa Ross, who is a great producer, I'm sure you're aware of her, she's making a film out of Days Without End and A Thousand Moons. And I said to her, you know, A Thousand Moons, maybe this is more like a detective, you used that word, Jen, detective novel. And she said, oh no, Sebastian, no. And I'm obeying her thought. It's a Western. Of course, Tennessee is southeastern, but nevertheless, I know exactly what she means. The atmosphere is Western. I have never read Cormac McCarthy's books, those books, like Blood Meridian. I believe in one of those books there's a character called John Cole, for instance. I first used the name John Cole in the early draft of this book in the 80s, strangely enough, but or an early effort at doing this book, my great uncle at the Indian Wars. So I promise you, I didn't steal it from Cormac, but I didn't read those books, Blood Meridian, etc. I think there's 3 in this trilogy, because I read the first page probably in the early 90s when it was published in 1992. And it was so addictive and amazing that I thought, I better not read this or I'll just write like him for the rest of my life. So, you know, that's the reason I didn't read that. But I can, even reading one page, and after all, I've only read one page of Finnegan's Wake as well, but I can recommend Finnegan's Wake, although I didn't get to page 2, but page 1 was pretty brilliant. I can recommend Cormac McCarthy on that basis.
Betsy M is asking, you've written plays as well as novels. How do you determine what material should be a play and what should be a novel?
Well, that's, you know, in the realm of beautiful questions, Betty. And like most beautiful questions, it's difficult to answer, but The Whereabouts of Thomas McNulty, for instance, which is the first book in these 8 books so far, hopefully a few more. I tried to write that as a play for Max Stafford Clark when I was working with him many years ago. And I wrote it, but I had a little problem in that Thomas McNulty didn't want to actually say anything. So that's not very useful in a play or very helpful. But I tried, you know, and Max noticed immediately that, you know, there was a certain problem with this. And that's probably one of the reasons why it is third person, in that Ennius was not keen to tell me the story himself. So he was saying, well, you're going to have to do a bit more work for me. So tough luck, my dear, you know, great nephew, whatever I am. And that's, you know, that's really what decides it. Again, I don't know how admirable that answer is to such a beautiful question, because it just sounds a bit, peculiar. But I have found that peculiarity has marked my existence to a rather surprising degree. On Blueberry Hill, which was my most recent...
Which had just opened before lockdown, hadn't it?
I was going to say my most recent alleged play. Yes, with Niall Buggy and David Ganley, directed by Jim Cullerton of Fishamble, the neatest and greatest theatre company in the world. We opened, Jenny, on the West End. You're an agent. You know what that means, what that meant to me. I've been writing plays for 40 years. I've never been on the West End. We got to the West End, March 11th, opened. Mark Lawson got up and roared for joy right in front of me. It was the loveliest thing. And it was actually a play about isolation, because it was two men in a jail, in Mountjoy Jail in Dublin. So that's rather strange in itself. But anyway, we had this most innocent and heartwarming and redeeming time on the so-called frightening West End, which turned out to be just the most welcoming and delicious place for myself, Jim, Niall, and David, and the rest of the Fishamble crew. We were just 6 years old again, as happy as Larry, walking down to the Duns of Fedden to get a nice feed of tea and big planks of sandwiches. We were happy. And then 4 days later, the history of the world so decreed that it had to be closed because, and I believe the posters are still up on Trafalgar Studios because, they haven't had a production there since. So if anyone is wandering through Trafalgar Square, take a picture and send it to me. The most lonesome and yet most joyous picture you could send me.
Oh, what a tragedy. Here is a question. I think we'll just have time for this last question. Helen L. says, is there a message you want readers to take away from reading this powerful novel?
My message, if I was writing it down, scribbling it down on a piece of paper as a real message, it would be, if it was the last message I was sending, as it were, I'd be scribbling it down and it would say something like, I was here on earth. My fate was to be a man. One of the things I noticed that seemed most important for me to tell you about is the courage of young women. Yours in desperation, Sebastian.
For me, a message from that novel is about love, and that love and families can be in all shapes and guises, not necessarily familial. Because the relationships we find between John Cole and Thomas McNulty, and between them and Winona and their household, and Winona and Peg, it really shines out from this novel, for me anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. When I was a child, there was a thing in Ireland called, and I'm sure they were well-meaning, well, they probably weren't, but anyway, they were called the League of Decency. And they were always giving out about gay people and, the loss of the family, the danger to a family, the family unit. And there was a sort of wicked joy for me in both these books, to demonstrate that actually, yet again, the most graceful, the most signal, the most important sort of family can be this sort of family. And this sort of family is the one you can learn from and use as a template for your own efforts in the world. Because, as you say, what John and Thomas and Winona and Peg and Rosalie Bouguereau and Tennyson possess and Lige is this miraculous thing that often looks a bit dubious on a Christmas cracker, but you and I have noticed does exist. Hallelujah, human love.
That's a lovely place to close, and we are out of time. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all your questions. Do think about making a donation to the book festival if you've enjoyed this event, because all the events are free this year. But most of all, thank you, Sebastian Barry, for the last hour. It's been a real privilege talking to you.
Thank you, Jenny. You're the sock dollager of interviewers.